I have never asked you guys to watch a Spooky Saturday video until the end. But today I am asking you. This story is so unpredictable. It takes so many twists, so many turns. There's so many head fakes that if you are going to watch this video, it is imperative that you at least try to finish. Now, the content of this video is going to be deeply triggering. So if you leave this video because of that, of course, that is completely fine. But if you are able to sit through it in its entirety, I please request that you do. Because if you leave partway through, you may end up thinking something happened that probably didn't. Hi guys, and welcome back to another Spooky Saturday. I know I took a little summer break, but I am back. A lot of things, personal update wise, have happened in the last couple months. I'm also going to be coming back with the podcast and regular programming, plus some new content on here that I'm really excited about as well. But I did get engaged while we've been gone. I'm pretty excited about that. So I am in wedding planning mode as well. So please try and be patient with me and my team because they can't get work done unless I send them stuff to do. With that being said, let's get into today's case. Today's case is going to be involving themes of DV, murder, child abuse, SA, R-word, as well as kidnapping. So if any of those subjects are particularly triggering for you, please feel free to opt out. As always, this is supposed to be a safe place. If you don't like it, you can go, and I will never hold that against you. It's a relatable experience, I think. At least it is for me. When you hear a story about a teenage girl or just a young girl in general, somebody who's relatively inexperienced, meeting an older guy and being dazzled by them. They seem more secure, they know more, they're more mature. It makes you feel special when someone like that looks at you, somebody who is just getting out into the world, and sees how special you are. It can be really, really intoxicating. And that's just from an older guy in general, let alone somebody who's popular, who's hot, who's cool and successful, who other guys look up to and they go, I want to be that guy. And that guy picked you. That can be really, really hard for a lot of girls to look past. And why look past it? I mean, of course, if you're a teenager and they're an adult, definitely look past it. But if everybody is of age, then you and most of your friends might agree that it's worth pursuing. Paul was really that kind of guy. Actually, his ex-classmates described him as being silver-tongued, wildly charismatic, super direct, super confident, and a high achiever. They said when Paul would speak, there was no awkward pauses, no ums. He never looked around the room. He never felt insecure. He always knew what he was saying when he was saying it, as if he had always known, as if he didn't require any thought before he spoke, because he was so confident that whatever he said was going to land. And that's because it did. Paul in high school, he knew that he wanted to be rich and famous one day. In fact, in his yearbook, he wrote as his dream that he wanted to be famous one day. And this was the 1980s when Paul was in high school, and so a classic 1980s dream would be to get that six-figure salary. In the 80s, that would be the equivalent of right now getting a multi-million-dollar salary, or at least $1 million salary. So when Paul said that he wanted to be an accountant because he knew that by being an accountant he would easily secure that six-figure salary, everybody was on board. They were so impressed. They were like, wow, he's really shooting for the stars, but you know what? We expect nothing less of Paul. And as much as people loved Paul, Paul also loved himself. Junior year of high school, he was gifted a camcorder, and this is when camcorder technology was brand new. People weren't really casually recording home videos before this. If you had a video camera, you really had to spend some money or at least have some sort of occupational access to that. And so when Paul got that camcorder, he started recording everything. I am convinced that if this story took place today, Paul would have 100% been an influencer, been a vlogger, and I also think that he would have been on a sort of early Jake Paul kind of vibe. He wasn't exactly like pranking his friends, there wasn't like an order to any of his videos, but he did constantly film anything and everything at all times. Paul was all about making memories. And that continued after he graduated high school as well. Once he started getting into the workforce, where he excelled, of course, it wasn't long before Paul was being invited to different conventions and, doing all of the things that a young, successful guy in the 80s would be doing. And one night, when he went to one of those conventions, he went down to the hotel bar, per diem, of course, and that's when he met Karla. Now, who is Karla? In order to get into her a little bit, we're going to rewind back in time a few years, back to when she was just 15 years old. Similarly to Paul, Karla was also very career focused. She was ambitious, and maybe she wasn't going for that six-figure salary, kind of a dream, but she did know what she wanted to do, and she took the steps to get there from an early age. She wanted to be a veterinarian, so she went out and she secured a job at a local pet store. And when she was at that pet store, she got to interact with a lot of animals, and she actually made a lot of friends as well. She was really popular with her coworkers, and not just the coworkers who were her age, but the older ones and the store owners. She became fast friends with literally everyone there. All the animals loved her. Everybody agreed that Karla was absolutely going to be an incredible vet one day. The love that she had for animals and the passion that she had for her future career was one of her most notable defining characteristics. The second most notable, maybe even the first defining characteristic about Karla, though, was, much like many 15-year-old girls, she was an absolute die-hard, hopeless romantic. She just wanted love so badly, and don't we all? But especially at that age, it ties into a lot of things. It ties into you're going through puberty, so you want to know that it paid off, all of the awkwardness. But also, most 15-year-olds have validation issues, and beyond just normal socialization, normal milestones of wanting to find a relationship, there is a sort of deeper sense of is somebody going to love me? There's that sense of urgency. You're so new to that world that you need the reassurance of someone wanting you. As the years went by, 2 years to be exact, Karla took care of many an animal, made many a friend at the pet store, and watched many a rom-com, I'm sure. And eventually, she was invited out by her boss to go to Toronto with one of her other young coworkers who was about 17. Karla was 17 as well at this time, to go to a pet supplier convention. And this was very exciting for the girls. It felt like a super adult thing for them to do with their job. And more than that, their parents weren't there. Yes, their bosses were the same ages as their parents, but it's a little bit different, and they had their own hotel room together, separate of their boss, of course. And so there was this sort of air of independence and lack of supervision there. It felt like one of her first steps out into being an independent adult. So when her boss and her husband went to go to sleep for the night, they assumed that Karla and her coworker were going to do the same. After all, they just had a very busy day at the pet supplier convention. But the girls had other plans because the hotel that they were staying at had a bar downstairs. And they figured if they just snuck down, being 17, they might just blend in. Unsurprisingly, as I'm sure you've guessed, this is where Karla and Paul first meet. And according to others who were present, some of Paul's coworkers and also his friends, as well as Karla's coworker and also her friend, it was apparently love at first sight. They immediately were drawn to one another, and Paul was so smooth, he was so suave, and he engaged in what we would now probably call early signs of love bombing. He came on really, really strong, and Karla, being a hopeless romantic, falls for it immediately. She's like, hey, this guy really, really likes me, and he's really cool, I like him too, and we're meeting at a bar, this is so exciting. And at this time, Karla is 17 years old, and Paul is 23. And after a couple hours at the bar, Paul and Karla decide that they should go up to Paul's hotel room, and that's where they first sleep together. After having this experience together, the two decided that we should keep the party going, and they officially started going steady. And it wasn't long before Karla started taking Paul around some of her other friends. He would show up at work. He always had gifts. He was very romantic, flowers, chocolates, as many expensive things as he could possibly buy her, he did. Because again, he was on that 80s grind set and he was bringing in cash. So he could afford to spoil Karla, and he made a big show about it every single time he did. And of course, while he was doing all of that, he always documented all of it on film. People loved them as a couple. They felt like they were a real match made in heaven. And I know what you're thinking, even though it's the 80s and this wasn't discussed as much, the age gap, what did Karla's parents think about that? Well, when she introduced Paul to her parents, Dorothy and Carl, they loved Paul. I mean, Paul was successful. Paul was good looking. Paul had good manners, and Paul definitely spoiled Karla. And it seemed like he was also emotionally spoiling her too, because she was absolutely glowing when he was around. Paul came over to Karla's house often. It actually seemed like he was almost never at his house. And Karla was the oldest of her three sisters. It goes Karla, Lori, and then Tammy, being the youngest. Tammy, I believe, was about 5 years younger than Karla was. So everyone in her family, all of her sisters, they kind of saw this as like an aspirational relationship. And Karla, being the oldest daughter, was sort of gaining a sense of independence, so her parents didn't really feel like it was all that strange for her to be dating someone in their 20s. Her bedroom was in the basement, so it almost felt like a basement apartment kind of situation. She'd been working at her job and doing well for the last 2 years, and this guy seemed really great and nice. If you're thinking that her parents were just open door policy with anybody who would be interested in their daughters, because some parents are like that, where they're just like, you like it, I love it. That's not necessarily true. Lori, the middle daughter, also had a boyfriend, and it's not that Dorothy and Carl didn't like Lori's boyfriend. They just didn't have the same level of respect that they had for Paul for Lori's boyfriend. Lori's boyfriend was 20, and they had started dating when he was a teenager as well. And when he would come over to the house, I'm just going to refer to him as he, because he doesn't want his identity to be disclosed. When he would come over to the house and he would want to hang out with Lori, Carl and Dorothy were super strict, like, hey, you can't go upstairs, you can't be near her bedroom, you guys can only hang out in the living room. But that wasn't the same for Paul and Karla. They actually even let Paul sleep over. Now, they had some boundaries. When Paul would sleep over, he had to sleep in the living room on the couch. But once Carl and Dorothy went to sleep, there was really nothing stopping Paul from sneaking down to the basement, which is basically what he did every single time. He would sneak down to the basement, him and Karla would do what they do, he would sleep down there, and he would just make sure that he would wake up early enough to return to the living room before Carl or Dorothy woke up. And this seemed to work without any issue for several months. And after several months had gone by, Carl and Dorothy decided that, you know what, we love Paul, we feel like he's part of the family, and I feel like you guys are going the whole 9 yards, so this is an adult relationship as far as we're concerned. Even though Karla is still in high school, we might as well just let Paul sleep downstairs. He's part of the family. Now, of course, Lori's boyfriend, he wasn't even allowed to sleep over on the couch once Paul was promoted to sleeping in the basement, so he was a little butthurt about it. But he did say that, like, even though there was a clear disparity between the way he and Paul were treated, and again, Carl and Dorothy weren't rude to him at all. They didn't dislike him as Lori's boyfriend. It was just that Paul had this sort of effect on people. He was so magnetic that after you hung out with him for a while, you just sort of wanted to give in to everything that he said. And they knew he wanted to be around Karla. They were like attached to the hip, so they just decided he should be allowed to sleep in the basement. And Lori's boyfriend really admired Paul too. You know, he was jealous of this, but he wasn't mad at Paul about it. He looked up to him. He was aspirational to him. He was like, I want to be that guy when I grow up in 3 years, because he's only a couple years older than him. And they developed a close bond. It was sort of like an older brother, younger brother kind of situation where he would give advice of like, you know, maybe if you do this or that, Dorothy and Carl will lighten up. You know, they were pretty easy with me. You know, just try doing things the way that I do them. And when Paul would sleep over, he'd wake up in the morning, they'd all have family breakfast together, and it was like he'd always been there. Now, I haven't really mentioned Tammy yet. She's the youngest sister, and Tammy loved hanging out with her older sisters on a classic younger sister style. She really looked up to them, especially Karla, since she was the oldest of her sisters. And she also really liked Paul. He felt like an older brother to her, and they would constantly play with each other, joke around, just the three of them, and it seemed like one big happy family. Since we've been talking about family so much, you might be wondering, what about Paul's family? And the answer is, I don't really know. All anyone said about Paul's family from any account that I could really see was just that everyone assumed he came from money. He was ambitious, he was clean cut, he always did well, he was popular, but there's not a lot of public information on his family, to be completely honest. This is all happening in Canada, by the way. Everything is light, everything is happy, everybody's friendly, it's freezing outside in wintertime. Great maple syrup. Sorry, I'm not trying to profile. But everything was sort of like the Canadian dream at this point for Karla and Paul. Or so you would think. Because in the background of their community, there was this sort of treacherous underbelly happening. And it was starting to send waves. Where they lived was a super safe area. It never really had a large crime problem. I mean, it wasn't like a micro community or anything like that. But it wasn't like this huge metropolitan sprawl where things are constantly happening and it just comes with the territory. But recently, Karla's parents, as well as every other young girl's parents in the area, were getting really worried about her and their other daughters because there were rising accounts of bad things happening to young girls. Because the thing was, right around the time that Karla and Paul met, the crime rate for sexual assaults in the area was very steadily rising, and the victims were almost always the same. It was girls between about 14 to maybe 19 years old, and a lot of them were being stalked, they were being abducted from their bus routes or walking on their way home, or God forbid in the middle of the night if they happen to catch themselves outside for some reason. And all of these girls were living to tell the tale. And the tale that they were telling was really horrific. It's 1987 in Scarboro, and the attack pattern was always the same. This unidentified attacker would approach his victims kindly, disarm them with how nice and gentle and agreeable they were, typically asking for directions or other innocuous questions, basically any appropriate excuse to approach somebody in public without it seeming like an obvious come on. That's what this person would use. And then, before you knew it, they had a knife to your throat. All of the victims were the same. Like I said, young girls, teenagers, but more than that, all of them were very, very petite, very short, very thin, very small. This attacker would, like I said, use this knife so that they didn't feel like they could get away, and then would cover their mouths or eyes or both with fabric. He would then use that fabric to gag them and proceed to engage in all forms of penetration. And on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, this person would engage in extreme degradation. Things like smushing their victims' faces into the dirt, or putting things inside their bodies like leaves and other things like that, or just random blunt force objects, just anything to degrade the victims, to dehumanize them, to make them feel small. In fact, these girls, like I mentioned, were so small that at one point, one girl's arm was broken because the attacker stepped on it, and that was all that it took. So that should give you an accurate understanding of the difference in scale between this attacker and these young girls. And on top of that, as if all of that wasn't already bad enough, because it truly is horrible, the attacker would also force all of his victims to say, "I love you," during the R words. They would then rip out chunks of their hair from their head and also from their pubic region, and that was the trophies that they chose to keep from their victims. And then they would just let their victims go. They would threaten them before they let them go with murder, telling them, they've been stalking them for days in advance, and they in fact had. That's how they knew their bus route, that's how they knew their routine. They had been following them, and they knew that to be true at that point in this encounter. And so when threatened with further violence, let alone death, let alone potential death of their friends or their family, because again, this person who had been stalking them for days at a time knew who they were related to, knew who they lived with, knew who they went to school with, knew who they liked to talk to on the bus. And that added in a psychological component, a fear factor that really diminished how many girls were willing to report. So it just seemed to Karla's coworkers that Paul's behavior was starting to escalate in terms of how controlling he was being, and they were worried, but it wasn't at a point where they felt like they could really say anything, especially because Karla seemed happy. She seemed to be really deeply content, and not only that, but she would brag about how happy she was in the relationship. So they sort of felt like, who am I to judge? Every relationship has different rules. If she's happy, you like it, I love it. But even though Karla's coworkers were a little worried and her parents noticed there was a little bit of arrogance to Paul, Karla still had a great social life. I mean, not with her coworkers hanging out outside of work, but mainly just her family life was where she got most of her socialization. And especially around the holidays, there was just a lot of energy, a lot of fun. The fact that there's 3 sisters and Paul's around and Leslie's boyfriend's around and their parents are there and everybody's having a great time. So when Christmas comes around, that's usually the best time of year for any happy big family like that. And Dorothy and Carl, they were the type of parents who were like, it's okay for the holidays if the kids have a drink or two. And this would be the first year that their youngest daughter, Tammy, was permitted to have a Christmas drink. Nothing too crazy, they didn't want her to get drunk or throw up or something like that, but she could have one drink with everybody else in the family. So when it's time for Tammy to have her one drink, looking up to Karla and Paul, she asks them to make it. Paul, being the better drink maker, volunteers to make it for her. But knowing she can only have one drink, he makes her a strong one. Like a really strong one. Like one that's too strong. And once Carl and Dorothy go up to bed, he keeps making Tammy drinks. He's overpouring her. He's filling her up the second that she gets too low. And of course, Tammy having never drank before, it's not long before she's absolutely wasted. At this point, everyone else in the family has gone to bed. The only people who are left standing is Tammy, Paul, and Karla. And like I said, Dorothy and Carl are completely ignorant to anything that's been going on downstairs whatsoever. As far as they knew before they went to bed, Tammy had one holiday drink, like they had all agreed upon. In fact, it's not till around 1 a.m. that the family is abruptly woken and sent into a hysterical panic. Because as it turns out, Christmas would be the worst day of their lives. Lori placed a call to her boyfriend at about 2 a.m. He answers, and she is absolutely hysterical. She's sobbing. He can barely understand anything that she's saying, but he can make out one very important thing. The words, "Tammy is not breathing." apparently she had a large lump in her throat and her face was covered in bile. She was found behind the living room couch. By the time that EMS arrives at the scene, she is definitively pronounced dead at just 14 years old. It's ruled that she drank too much and she threw up while sleeping, passed out behind the couch on her back, and ended up choking on her own bile, thus causing the large lump in her throat. This was just an absolutely devastating blow to the entire family, especially to have this tragic accident on Christmas of all times. It's just an absolute nightmare. It's every parent's nightmare. And of course, Carl and Dorothy, they felt responsible. They said that she could have a drink and then they went to bed. They didn't think that it would end up like this. I mean, they had done similar things with their other two daughters and it had always been fine. And of course, Paul was feeling pretty responsible, but no one other than Karla really knew at that point that Paul had been pouring Tammy's drinks. It was just all so sad. She was so young. She was really, really outgoing. She had a big personality. She was athletic. She was involved in a lot of things at school, and everyone just took it really, really hard, especially Karla. Her coworkers said that she would come to work and she would just have these fits of, a panic where she would just end up absolutely sobbing in their arms. And of course, they understood, as much as one can, and they would comfort her. And it was just, they would just think to themselves, like, God, poor Karla, When it came to the funeral, Karla and Paul, they were very distant. They were in sort of a back corner, and everybody just got the impression that they were so devastated by it all. The family knew that they were downstairs with her most recently, and they knew they must feel guilty for that. Lori knew that Paul had made Tammy's drink, and she had shared that information with her boyfriend, and they never mentioned that to them. It was sort of like a quiet understanding of like, hey, don't bring that up. I'm sure they already feel bad enough. So when they were distant at the funeral, everybody just thought it's because they're just like, they're so inconsolable. There's nothing anyone can say to them. So they're just hanging back. And right after the funeral, Karla and Paul moved out. They got their own place. They didn't want to be around all those memories anymore, and they had taken the time to save up some money living with Karla's parents, so it just seemed like time for a change. When they moved in together, Paul went full family vlogger with it. He started documenting the entire process, of course. He documents everything. I genuinely believe, like I said earlier, that he would have been a family vlogger at this point. Also, once they had their own place, this meant getting dishes, getting furniture, getting appliances, and they started to get really flashy with their material possessions, to a point that, some of their friends and family felt that it was a little tasteless. It lacked a little tact just because they were very braggadocious about it all. One of the things that Paul got for Karla as a gift, an expensive gift, was a Rottweiler. Karla loves animals and she sees a lot of dogs in her line of work. Paul didn't actually like dogs or animals for that matter. To Paul, Buddy, their Rottweiler, was sort of a source of shit, piss, drool, and hair, which is all technically true. I mean, we all got to shit, piss, drool, and hair sometimes. But to him, a pet was just sort of like an unnecessary mess in their meticulously organized materialistic space. And the only reason he really got Buddy was because he felt like that's the kind of thing a good boyfriend does, is their girlfriend's sister dies, she loves animals, we move into our new place, so it's sort of the first step in creating our family of two. First thing you do is get a dog, right? But he didn't have the temperament to deal with an animal, let alone a Rottweiler, which needs a lot of exercise, a lot of attention. I have Dobermans. I have two Dobermans. you cannot neglect a Rottweiler or a Doberman. It's a recipe for behavioral issues. You're going to give your dog a mental illness because they need stimulation just via being outside, smelling things, mental stimulation, visual stimulation, prey reflex, cardio. They need all of that stuff. It's not like having a purse dog. They need to do those things. But Paul wasn't interested in doing any of that. He wasn't interested in any dog training, which again is like a liability with a big dog. You can't just not train your big dog. But he didn't train his big dog. And Karla should have known better, but she didn't really train the big dog either. So when Buddy would get excited about anything, like Karla comes home, Paul comes home, he would piss all over the floor, which is also not that uncommon for dogs in general. There's certain dogs that just sort of do that. My parents had a dog that just did that for like 20 years, no matter what we did. My dogs don't do it. I think it's just some dogs are more likely to do it, and you can probably take measures to train that out of your dog, especially when they're a puppy. But again, they didn't do any of that stuff. So when Buddy would piddle on the floor like that, instead of having, you know, a more normal reaction of like, oh wow, we really gotta like train this behavior out of him. You know, I can't keep doing this. It's so freaking annoying having to clean up piss every time I come home first thing. He would just lock Buddy in the basement in a crate as a sort of punishment, and he would just keep him down there all day, which is really very cruel. And that was sort of his approach to anything. It wasn't just when Buddy would do something that Paul didn't like or have an accident. He would really just kind of lock him in the crate downstairs in the basement anytime that he was home, and of course also when he wasn't home, just to avoid taking care of him. The only person who ever really engaged with Buddy, from what I can tell, is Karla. Then in June of 1991, just 1 year after the most recent Scarboro R-word attack, a 14-year-old girl named Leslie failed to return home to her parents' home 1 hour after she left her friend's house. Immediately, this wasn't actually cause for concern. Again, they no longer live in Scarboro. They're in St. Catharines, which is a really small town. And it's a safe town. Nothing really happens there. Not in a it's a meaningless, boring place kind of way. Just like there's not really any cause for concern. This is the kind of place where people often leave the doors unlocked, you know? And it was a nice, like, leafy area. And more than that, Leslie was sort of one of those kids who really rebelled. She was just sort of sowing her wild oats a little bit, acting out, and that's not abnormal for a 14-year-old. But she was taking it a little bit further than the average 14-year-old. Nothing too crazy. She wasn't going full euphoria with it or something like that. But her parents were, needless to say, kind of getting sick of her shit. They had been trying to enforce boundaries and rules, and she was just stepping all over them. And so on this particular night, Leslie's mother didn't know what else to do. She had missed her curfew over and over and over again, and so she decided the only way she's going to learn her lesson about showing up to the house on time is sort of that very parental little phrase of like, hey, this is our house, not a hotel. Like, don't treat this like a hotel where you just sleep here and then leave all day, kind of a thing. So her mom locked her out. Leslie goes up to the door, finds that it's locked, calls one of her friends and is like, hey, my parents locked me out, can I sleep over at your house? Her friend's like, no. My parents said, no, you can't. She's like, okay, I'll figure something out. I'm sure they're going to open it soon. Basically just plans to like hang around for the next hour or two until her mom feels guilty and goes and unlocks the door. And also, a brief side note here, don't do that as like a lesson for your kids. I'm not telling people how to parent or anything. I'm just saying, if you take away anything from this part of this video, that's not a good way to teach your kids a natural repercussion. When you're an adult, you live on your own. You have your keys. No matter what time you get back, you're not going to be locked out of your own house. You know what I'm saying? And more than that, it's just dangerous. It's just needlessly dangerous. You don't want somebody to be unable to access a safe, soft place to land. If if the worst thing they're doing is just breaking curfew. I'm not trying to say that Leslie's mom is like a bad person or did something super terrible. I think she was just an exhausted mom, didn't know what else to do. But I'm just saying to all my exhausted moms out there, maybe don't do that one. It's just, it makes me nervous. It's really risky. All the same though, when Leslie disappeared, no one thought she was a victim of anything. She was just automatically a presumed runaway, which unfortunately happens a lot, but especially in a town like this, there's only so many kids who are known for being rebellious at any given time. There's only so many kids in general, so she had a reputation, and people just thought, this is probably just like another act of rebellion. Her parents thought that as well. Essentially, no one was either shocked or concerned. Like, yeah, there's not a lot of runaways out of St. Catharines, but if there were to be a runaway, I guess it would probably be Leslie. That's basically how people felt. And just 2 weeks later, on June 29th of 1991, Paul and Karla got married. Yeah, they had a huge wedding, actually. 7 bridesmaids, super expensive. One of the guys at the wedding said that Karla's wedding dress was literally 5 times the price of his new car. And other guests described Paul as looking like a rock star. People said it genuinely felt like a 1980s royal wedding. And from the footage of it, it looked like one. They poured a ton of money into this thing very clearly. Big dress, nice suit, fancy cars, tons of decorations. It was an entire public spectacle. It was a huge, huge moment. And they were really using this moment to flex a lot of their material wealth, but people were still happy for them, even though they felt like it was a little bit over the top, it was a little bit unnecessary. Everyone was wondering, what is the price tag on this thing? It was clear that they really loved each other, and in their vows they said that when they first met, it was clear that they were a match made in heaven, a perfect match for one another. And Karla's sister Lori even says on camera, Paul is the best thing that ever happened to Karla. But after the reception, during the after party, some weird things started happening. Not with the party itself, actually it was a huge rager. Everyone was having a great time. But in the background of the bar that they were at, the news was really alarming. Because you see, just 18 miles away, at Lake Gibson, a well-known lake in the area, a popular fishing spot actually, there was a crime scene. And because literally no crime happens in St. Catharines, it was on every single news station. It was all anyone was talking about. They were doing non-stop updates because earlier that day, a fisherman by the name of Bill, his occupation's not fisherman, but he was going to fish. He saw there was a little outcropping into the lake of some cement rocks, and he decided that was the best place for him to launch his canoe from. So he unloads his canoe, he gets it down over the water, he's getting ready to push off with his oar, and he wedges it between 2 cement blocks and pushes. And when he does this, those blocks separate a little bit and he sees something strange, so he stops. Between the blocks, he notices that the inside of them is really red. It's like stained, it looks like rust colored. And there's like a weird fleshy tissue, and it's clearly not a fish. He wasn't sure what he was looking at first, but after a few double takes he realized it was definitely a foot. And not only was it a foot, but it was just 2 feet off of the shore. Why would that be there? Immediately, while the whole bridal party is watching the news, immediately one of the groomsmen turns to the crowd and he announces there's no way that it was a local. And a lot of people who were from St. Catharines who were attending the wedding party, they're all nodding in agreement. And that is because everybody who lives in St. Catharines knows that that lake's water level drops like 5 feet this time of year every year, and it's not a very deep lake. So if you're trying to hide anything in there, it's gonna come up. When the water level drops, you can practically see everything in the lake. It was not long before the dental records proved that this was, in fact, the body of 14-year-old Leslie. And the fisherman, Bill, who discovered this, was deeply, deeply traumatized and struggles with PTSD to this day. Her entire body was in that lake, dismembered, hidden under those concrete blocks. The entire community was absolutely shaken to their core, especially there was like a sense of guilt in the air since nobody even thought to think that Leslie could possibly be in any sort of real danger, since they had all just assumed she ran away. In fact, a lot of the young people in town felt really badly too, because they were some of the first people to reassure the adults, like, yeah, we're pretty sure that Leslie just ran away. I mean, she was going through a rebellious phase. She was fighting with her parents, specifically her mom, a lot, so we're not surprised. And one of those people who did end up feeling bad about doubting Leslie and just not thinking anything actually bad could have happened to her, that she was a victim, was one of Carla's co-workers, Leanne. Leanne was like a young teenage girl, and they were around the same age, and so she knew her, and they weren't exactly friends, but they were classmates, and they knew a lot of the same people, and so it felt much more close to home for her than someone like Karla, who was already in their early 20s. And as a result, they would talk about the case and how it's unfolding at work sometimes, especially because it was like mainstream news at this point, and everyone in town was discussing it. And like I said, Paul liked to visit Karla a lot at work. So he would show up and he would be like, hey, Leanne, and then go talk to Karla. And over time, they developed a little bit of rapport where Paul would start to ask more questions, start a little bit deeper of a conversation, like, oh, are you still dating that guy? Or like, oh, you like somebody new? Or like, what's going on? What's going on at school? How are your classmates? Blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't long before Paul started asking Leanne to hang out, where he was like, hey, why don't you come hang out this weekend with Karla and I if you don't have any plans? And Leanne was a little confused by this, so she would just make excuses like, oh, I have a lot of homework, or like, oh, I can't, or like, oh, my parents said no, just because she wasn't quite sure why somebody in their mid-20s or their younger 20s would want to hang out with like a teenager. I mean, they didn't have much in common, but after a while of them asking and offering, eventually she just changed her mind because she started to second guess, like, maybe it's not that weird. So on the weekends, she would go hang out with them at their house sometimes, and it was fun, you know? I mean, there's still the age gap, which is a little bit weird, but they all seemed to have a nice enough time together, and then her and Karla would hang out at work, and so it was one of those coworker friendships where it ends up crossing over into just a normal friendship outside of work. And Leanne's initial thoughts of like, oh, maybe this is weird that Paul is asking me this, like, I'm not sure how Karla would feel with her husband asking me this, quickly went away when she realized, like, yeah, it's fine, nothing weird's happening, and Karla doesn't seem to care at all. Then on April 16th, 1992, just 9 months after Leslie had disappeared and presumably been murdered since she was dismembered, Kristen disappears, who was just 15 years old. She was actually abducted on her way home from school at approximately 2:35 in the afternoon. She was still in her school uniform and everything. Witnesses saw her approached in a church parking lot by a car with what looked to be 2 passengers inside. They couldn't get a great look, but it looked to be more than one person. And after a moment of talking through the window, they saw that Kristen started to back away from the car and then was pulled in to the car, and the car sped away. This is in broad daylight. There are people around. A girl has just been murdered in this past year, just 9 months ago. There was some evidence left behind at the scene. Notably, one of Kristen's shoes had come off due to the scuffle, and her mom quickly identified and confirmed that it was in fact Kristen's shoe. This immediately hits the news. It starts spreading like wildfire, it goes crazy, especially because of what had just recently happened to Leslie. People are very, very worried about Kristen and her status as somebody who's still alive. I mean, directly after an abduction period, there is a sweet spot. You do want to find somebody within a certain amount of time, or the odds that they are dead go exponentially up. Her parents did a press conference, the police did a press conference, local officials did a press conference, and they got literally the entire community involved. 2,200 people ended up showing up for the search party, which was way more people than investigators had even expected, and they expected a lot. In addition to the search party, there were vigils all over town, and Karla's young coworker, Leanne, and her mother decided that they were going to go to one of the vigils, and so they asked Karla if she would like to go when they're at work. And she was like, oh yeah, I probably should. That sounds like a nice idea. Then on April 30th, 1992, unfortunately, Kristen's body was discovered. She was nude, found in tall grass just off the side of the road in the fetal position. A Mickey Mouse watch that she had worn at all times was gone, as well as another piece of unidentified jewelry. Her hair had been cut. And this hit a little bit differently than Leslie, because although Leslie still had friends, she was loved in the community, she was still going through that rebellious phase. So there were some people who are wrong, because there is no such thing as a perfect victim. There were some people who were of the poor opinion that she invited that upon herself because she had been getting into trouble. Kristen, however, was a model student. She was involved in sports. She was popular. She had a future that people believed in a way that not everybody, unfortunately, believed in Leslie. And so the public outcry over Kristen was so much louder. And of course, that's also due to the fact that Leslie had been murdered first. And of course, investigators immediately knew, like, this has to be linked to the Leslie case. I mean, what are the odds of two girls in the same demographic to go missing and then be murdered in this small town where nothing bad has really ever happened? And after this, I mean, there was a huge cultural shift in St. Catharines. Nobody went outside anymore, especially not any teenagers, but even adults. People were afraid. It put this cloud over the entire community, this deep sense of panic, because now everybody knew this is something that could very well keep happening. It's not like a passer through who did that to Leslie. This is somebody who is here, or at least nearby, somebody who's going to keep coming back here probably. This is obviously someone's hunting ground. As if things weren't going badly enough for the community as a whole, it seemed that not everything was happy in paradise between Karla and Paul either. Lori's boyfriend, the same boyfriend she'd had this entire time throughout all of the events in this video, claims that he went over to Karla and Paul's house, something that he did relatively often because, again, he really looked up to Paul. And when he was there, he was now 20 at this point in time, Paul offered him a drink. And he said yes, that he would take a drink. Paul sort of barked over at Karla and instructed her to then make Leslie's boyfriend a drink. He sort of protested like, oh no, like I didn't think that meant like you were gonna now tell her to do it. Like, no, I don't want to be a bother. And Paul sort of snapped back at him like, don't worry about it. This is what she's supposed to do. And Leslie's boyfriend had never really seen this side of Paul before, so he was a little taken aback. But, you know, Karla went and she made a drink for him. She brought it into the room that they were in and she set it down on the coffee table. When Karla places the drink on the coffee table for Lori's boyfriend, Paul slaps her across the face. Just slaps her across the face. Lori's boyfriend is shocked. There's a bit of a power imbalance between him and Paul. You know, he's not ready to fight Paul. He just has never seen this side of him, but he's not going to sit there in total silence and be completely complicit either. So he's like, Paul, you know, like, it's really like fine. Like, I didn't expect her to do any of this. Like, this is a lot. At which point Paul yells at him and he's like, don't tell me what to do in my house. kind of a thing. He's kind of scared in this moment, you know? He's like the youngest person here. He's not sure what to do. He's never seen domestic violence before. And then Karla and Paul go off into the kitchen. Paul starts yelling at her, "That's not how you treat a guest." He expected her to bring the drink out on a literal silver platter that they had in their home. And he expected it to be done in a very specific way, that there was supposed to be a drink on the silver platter next to a folded napkin, and that she would present it to their guests. He told her, and I quote, "You are supposed to serve our guests." Paul comes back, and then shortly thereafter, Karla comes out with the silver platter, with the drink and a napkin, tears in her eyes, and she serves the drink to Leslie's boyfriend. It's around this time that Karla starts dressing differently at work. You know, instead of wearing short sleeves when it's hot outside, she's still wearing long sleeves, long pants. Her coworkers start to notice a little stranger behavior. Again, Paul is also being stranger, and it doesn't take long for them to put things together. They start noticing that Karla is clearly coming into work injured, and they think Paul's the one who's doing it. The abuse starts to very aggressively escalate. Karla's entire look is totally changed at this point in time from what it was when they first started dating. I mean, when they first started dating when she was 16, she was a little heavier and she had curly, naturally brown hair, and now she was stick thin. Her hair was bleach blonde and perfectly pin straight every single day. It was almost like she was a different person, and she used to have this big, vibrant personality, and now she was a sort of shell of her former self. On top of that, Paul, who already called work a lot, would call and make her drop whatever she's doing. It didn't matter what was happening. Her coworkers would be like, "Do you really have to do that right now?" And she'd be like, "Yes, I do. Paul told me." So it was very obvious to them what must be going on. Eventually, Karla has had enough. She goes to the police station, and both of her eyes are severely blackened. She goes in and she reports that she is the victim of domestic violence, that she is a battered wife. She sits down with the cops to do an interview, and that's when she drops a bombshell on them that they could not possibly have seen coming. She tells them that Paul killed Leslie and Kristen, and that she's willing to tell them anything that they need to know to ensure that they, quote, "put that bastard away for good. He doesn't even deserve to live, but I also don't want him to die. I want him to suffer." She starts spilling the beans. First, she outlines the domestic violence. That's why she was there in the first place. She claims that he would routinely do cruel things to her, and I really mean routinely, like on a strict routine. One thing that he did essentially every day, according to Karla, was have her kneel in their bedroom and face the bed, and she wasn't allowed to watch him while he walked around the room, and he would encircle her, and then he would kick her at random times. And since she wasn't allowed to look away from the bed, she wouldn't know when he's about to kick her. So there's physical and psychological violence there. Karla then starts detailing Leslie's kidnapping, torture, R word, and eventual murder. She claims that Paul went out, he was driving around looking for victims, because, of course, he was also the Scarboro R word, which is mind-blowing to these investigators because these two cases hadn't been linked at that point in time, even though there was a tenuous link with Kristen's hair being taken when they found her body. She explains that this is something he would do. He would drive around, he would stalk victims for days at a time if there was somebody that he liked. And on that fateful night, he saw Leslie locked outside of her house. He drove up, charismatically, disarmingly, offered her a ride home. Because like I said, she had tried to go sleep over at a friend's. She was told no. On her way back, that's when she had the misfortune of running into Paul. She agrees because she has nothing else to do. This is generally a safe neighborhood. It's leafy, it's green, it's suburban. She just didn't really have her guard up, even though this is an adult man and she's a teenage girl. That just speaks to like the culture of the town. And of course, once Leslie's in the car, she's threatened with a knife and she's now unable to leave. Paul takes Leslie back to their home and puts her in their basement where she is bound. He goes upstairs to where Karla is asleep and he wakes her up and informs her, "Hey, don't worry, there's a girl in the basement. Go back to sleep." And Karla does. She goes back to sleep. Then, of course, just like Paul, who videotapes everything, he then documents the assault, essay, R-word, and torture of Leslie in their basement. He kept Leslie alive for days, and Karla pretty regularly interacted with her. She said that she took pity on her. She would go down there, she would talk to her. She said that she really empathized with her and bonded with her, but she didn't feel like she could help her because she was afraid of Paul, and Paul threatened to kill her and her family if she did anything to interfere with his plans. She said that at one point Leslie was crying and said that she just wanted to see her little brother again, and so Karla gave her a teddy bear to comfort her. Shortly thereafter, she was R-worded again by Paul. Then she was strangled with an electrical wire until she was killed. Just hours later, while Leslie is still freshly deceased in Paul and Karla's basement, Dorothy and Carl, Karla's parents, as well as her siblings, come over for dinner. Leslie is still in the basement because, you see, Paul had killed Leslie on Father's Day. And Karla thought that it would look suspicious if they canceled their Father's Day plans. She said it would remove their alibi. And so rather than canceling their Father's Day plans, they had Father's Day just one floor above the dead body of an abducted teenager who had experienced literally the worst things one can experience just hours earlier. At one point, when they're preparing the meal, Dorothy, Karla's mother, goes to get something from the basement. I think it was potatoes. And she's stopped. Because, of course, Paul and Karla can't let her get down there. They can't let her see this girl who is not even hidden in the basement, the same basement where they keep their Rottweiler buddy caged up. And in that moment, Karla's mother came dangerously close to finding out a very, very dangerous secret. And it was narrowly avoided. After the family leaves, Paul then dismembers Leslie's body, and it is at that point that he dumps her remains in the lake under the concrete. After this murder, Paul then insists that Karla come along for all of the future kidnappings, that she be involved in the assaults, in the torture, and in the killing. At this point, Karla was already in way too deep. Her and Paul were already engaged. And this is all happening, just a refresher of the timeline, very shortly after Tammy's death, Karla's youngest sister. A lot of things are happening back to back to back to back in Karla's life that are very overwhelming. And just a couple weeks after Leslie is killed, dismembered, and disposed of in a lake, just a reminder, Paul and Karla get married in a very public, very audacious, seemingly very happy wedding. And it is on that same day, poetically, that Leslie's body is discovered. It wouldn't be until the first day of their honeymoon that Karla is informed by Paul that he is the Scarboro R-worder. It's at this point in time that Karla also reveals to police that Paul had videotaped all of his crimes, but she makes it clear that she doesn't know where the tapes are. She tells them that last she saw them, they were in some sort of crawl space in the house. This gives the police enough to take Paul into custody and to get a warrant issued to check the home. They check the home incredibly thoroughly and they don't find anything. They rip up the carpet in the basement. There is no evidence of blood splatter anywhere. Not even drops that seeped through the carpet and got onto the wood of the stairs. Nothing. There's no evidence that Leslie or Kristen were anywhere in this house. And there's certainly no tapes. They get 2 extensions to check this house. 2 extensions to make sure that they can be as thorough as possible. There are 72 days in which they are checking this house, morning till night, top to bottom, and they don't find anything. They leave that entire experience with 0 physical evidence against Paul. All they have is the circumstantial evidence provided by Karla. They need her testimony. And because of that, they need to keep asking questions. Karla details to them Kristen's murder. The eyewitness account of the abduction was correct. What had happened was Karla and Paul pulled up to Kristen in the parking lot, and Karla was the one who was meant to disarm Paul's victims from this point forward because she was a woman. Their guard would naturally be lower. They would trust another woman more than they would trust Paul. So they pulled over, she had a map out and was pretending to ask for directions, at which point Paul got out of the car, crept around to the other side, and grabbed Kristen and then threatened her with a knife. He would drive around and stalk victims non-stop. He had a fantasy of owning sex slaves and being able to keep them forever. And he was satiating that fantasy by keeping them for just short spurts of time. Kristen, unfortunately, Paul kept longer than Leslie. Karla explains that because Kristen was kept longer, she had more time to get to know her, that they were friends, actually. That during the day they would just do girl stuff together. They would do each other's makeup and hang out. Things that make it sound like it's a slumber party. Karla said that Paul made her engage in SA against the victims from this point forward, including Kristen, and that she was an unwilling participant and a victim of the SA herself as a result. She said that Paul R-worded Kristen one last time before taking the same electrical wire that he had strangled Leslie with, binding Kristen's legs together, and then suffocating her with his own hands. Afterwards, he then rolled her up into a carpet and disposed of her body on the side of the road, after taking a chunk of her hair, of course. It's at this point that Lori's boyfriend is brought in for questioning as well to corroborate some of this, since he went over to their house often. They wanted to know if he heard anything strange, witnessed anything, saw any girls. And it is then brought to his attention that some of the noises, the whining, scratching, bumping around sounds that he was hearing from the basement, a lot of those were probably not their Rottweiler buddy. A lot of those were probably Kristen, because when that slap happened, Kristen was in the basement, alive. Karla tells the police that actually the tipping point for her, even though she feels now stupid for not coming forward earlier, was that the night before when Paul had beaten her eyes in, he also attempted to strangle her with that same wire, and that she truly believed that she would be his next victim and that he would never stop. On February 17th, 1993, Paul is then arrested for these crimes very publicly. It is announced everywhere that both the murderer of Kristen and Leslie, as well as the Scarboro R-worder, have been taken into custody because they are the same person. His identity is released to the public, and Carla's co-workers are shocked. I mean, at this point, they didn't have that high of an opinion of Paul, but they still couldn't have imagined that he would do anything to this scale. 3 days after, Leslie and Kristen's parents come together and they do a press conference, and Paul is assigned attorney Ken Murray. It is also at this point that a very unnerving fact of this case is brought to the public's attention. The Scarboro SA squad that had been newly established when the Scarboro R-worder had come to notoriety, it turns out that they actually had investigated Paul, but he wasn't arrested. They investigated Paul because a close family friend had seen the sketch of the Scarboro R-worder, rightfully said, hey, that looks exactly like Paul, because the sketch is truly very accurate and it does look exactly like Paul. Called in to the police and said, hey, have you looked at this guy yet? Because I know for a fact that he assaults drunk girls at parties and that he's a known misogynist. So I really truly think between that and the fact that he looks exactly like the composite sketch that you need to question him. I really believe he's the Scarboro R-worder. So police go to his house, but he's not home. They leave a note on his door with their contact information basically saying, hey, call me. And Paul does. Right when he gets home, he calls them. They schedule a time for him to come in. He answers all of their questions. He even makes a joke about how, yeah, he does look exactly like the composite sketch. And at the end, they're like, hey, we've been taking everybody's DNA sample. Are you willing to provide a sample? Paul is one of the 1,000 people who have been questioned by this SA squad for this case at this point in time. He volunteers his DNA. He's happy to do it. He didn't have to do that. He could have made them go the warrant route, which probably would have been difficult considering how many people they were looking at and how flimsy the evidence was. But he was so agreeable that it just completely threw the cops off, where they thought, now why would he do that if it's him? So they let him go. You may also be wondering, hey, if they have his DNA, how come they didn't just literally know it was him? Unfortunately, the entire territory used just one DNA specialist for forensic cases at this time. This is when DNA evidence in forensic cases was super new. It was not the well-oiled machine that it is today, which even still, it takes a long time unless you put a rush on something. So they didn't actually get the results of his DNA test for 2 years. So they collected his DNA before Paul had ever, to our knowledge, killed anyone, and they didn't actually get the results that proved he was in fact the Scarboro R-worder until after he had already killed Leslie and Kristen. 9 days after his arrest, he was officially charged with 16 counts of R-word. Paul then informs his attorney confidentially of the location of the infamous tapes. Like I said, they did a 10-week-long search of his home. They never found anything. Paul, from prison, drew out a map detailing exactly where his attorney needed to go to find the tapes. He needed to go into the house, into the bathroom, unscrew a light bulb, and in the socket were the tapes. And they absolutely were. He found 6 tapes up there. Now, this is where things get even more frustrating, because Ken Murray, a practicing attorney who has in fact passed the bar, instead of turning those tapes in, which is something he's legally required to do when physical evidence is presented in a case, he decides to sit on them, to keep them just for himself, not to turn them in, not let his opposition see them, not let media or investigators know that they've ever been found, and that he's confirmed that they do in fact exist and that he's watched them. Why? Why would someone want to do that? Because he wanted to have his gotcha moment in court. At this time, the only thing that investigators had on their side against Paul was Karla's word. Like I said, there was no physical evidence aside from evidence for the R words. So they could very well successfully charge Paul with being a serial R-worder, but they're not getting a murder conviction as of now unless they have Karla as a star witness. They need her testimony. So is he just not turning in the tapes because it has evidence that Paul really did do all the stuff Karla said? Yeah. But how is that a gotcha moment for him if he's representing Paul, if he's Paul's defense? It's a gotcha moment for him because the tapes also reveal that Karla was lying, not about Paul, but about her involvement. And I'll get into exactly the extent of Karla's involvement in a moment, but it's important to know that while this is happening, while Paul's defense is sitting on this key evidence, waiting for that gotcha, I know you're lying moment in court, waiting for that media moment where everyone's going to be like, oh wow, look at this attorney, he really backed her into a corner, now what? While that's happening, investigators from this case who are trying to get justice for this family, who have no interest in defending somebody like Paul, or anybody for that matter, who is involved in committing these crimes, who are just trying to seek justice, they're trying to prep Karla to be the best witness that she can be because this case is riding on her. They sent her out to get psychologically assessed, at which point it's determined that she has battered woman syndrome. Battered woman syndrome creates this sort of learned helplessness out of fear. It's almost like a fawn response. And so they were going to use that result from that assessment to demonstrate why Karla was complicit in the ways in which Karla admitted to being complicit. And that is important for framing her testimony correctly so that the jury still views her as a victim. She is a battered wife who was forced to participate in horrible things, rather than she is Paul's wife, she helped Paul. You see what I mean? They're basically going with a classic he made her this way narrative. And even though they're doing their best, they want to make sure that they position Karla correctly, these are still seasoned professionals, and they are noticing some inconsistencies, some issues with Karla's behavior versus her situation. As time moves on, Karla keeps asking if they found the tapes. They haven't, so they keep telling her no. This builds her confidence. Instead of being as meek and reserved as she was before, she now starts to get a little more comfortable with the idea that she may not have to do damage control with anything that's on these tapes. But she is still playing it smart. She was actually ranked for being in the top 2 percentile intellectually, which it's kind of actually hard to measure intellect correctly. IQ is a very imperfect system, but nonetheless, they're playing a very high-level game of chess here, the investigators and Karla, because even if there are things Karla is doing that are setting off their sort of bullshit meter, they cannot alienate Karla. They need her on the stand if they want to get that murder conviction. And as time is going on, Karla is acting in ways that are, and I don't say this flippantly, acting in ways that are pretty sociopathic. The mask starts slipping a little bit. The more comfortable she gets, the more further removed she feels from a conviction. She starts admitting to certain things to try and get ahead of the narrative in case Paul brings them up or maybe the tapes get found. And the biggest bombshell that she admits to her involvement in is the fact that Tammy, her youngest sister, didn't actually die of a terrible accident on Christmas. She didn't die of alcohol poisoning at all. Paul had been bothering Karla, saying that he wanted to sleep with Tammy, her youngest sister, who was 15. Karla was 20. She claimed that he had bothered her so much that she just wanted him to just shut up so that they could move on from it. So she just agreed that his Christmas present will be her youngest sister Tammy, that she will help Paul R-word her 15-year-old sister as a Christmas present. And Paul is just her boyfriend at this point in time. So investigators, they have a lot of thoughts going through their mind. She is living with her parents and with Paul, yes, at this time that this Christmas event takes place. For most people, this would be, coming from a safe family unit, as Karla does, one of the better situations you could find yourself in if your boyfriend is saying and doing things of this nature. Your parents are in the house. You have people who can help you, who are right there. And Karla's response was just that she was worried that they would then get hurt as a result of her rejecting Paul and the things Paul wants to do. So Paul tells Karla to steal halothane from work, because she worked as a vet tech at that point. Halothane is a strong chemical, a sometimes fatal chemical, that they often use to knock out cats and dogs and other animals, mainly cats and dogs due to size, for surgery. And it is really important. Anybody who's worked with animals, who has interacted with halothane, would know it is very important that when it is applied to a rag, because it is a liquid, that it is not put on any mammal's face. It doesn't touch their skin or anything like that, because it is incredibly potent. It's very easy to kill the animals if the halothane is too close. This is something that would have been hammered into Karla's head millions and millions and millions of times, and at this point she had years of experience working with these animals. And so she tells investigators that because of this, she did steal the halothane from work, and when it came time to drug her little sister Tammy, she applied the halothane to the rag, held it the appropriate foot distance away, and that Tammy was then incapacitated. At this point, Paul R-words Tammy, both genitally and anally. And it becomes quickly apparent thereafter that Tammy is not reacting to the halothane the way that Karla expected, and she ends up dying as a result. So it was still an accident in a way, but it's not a my little sister drank and got alcohol poisoning kind of accident. It's a I committed manslaughter kind of accident. Obviously, the police are shocked and very disturbed by this information, but again, they need Karla. They can't let her know that. They have to stay on her good side in order to get this murder conviction of Paul. She then admits to the second most concerning thing that she has told them. And this isn't just back-to-back admissions, of course. This is over a long period of questioning, coming in on different days for weeks and weeks, months and months, because like I said, the further removed the idea is that Karla's going to get in trouble, the more comfortable she is, the more the mask starts to slip and she starts admitting to things that are really pretty damning. The next of which being that she actually told Paul to kill Kristen. According to her, not in those exact terms, but she said that she didn't want to miss the Father's Day dinner because it would look suspicious. So therefore, Kristen needs to go, which is, in other words, her putting a time limit, letting Paul know, you need to take care of this, which of course she knew only really meant one thing. The next thing that really just gives the police pause is the police ask her to do a walkthrough of her home to detail where different things took place so that they can videotape her, show it in court. This happened here, this happened there, I remember like this. And as they walk into the house, Karla shows up to this event that she knows is going to be filmed and showed in court, dressed as a schoolgirl in a traditional schoolgirl uniform. Not like a Britney Spears schoolgirl, like she has the plaid skirt, she has the shirt with the cardigan, like the whole outfit that they actually wear at the local schools. She's in her like mid-20s. It's odd. They felt like she was trying to subconsciously tie herself in with these young victims. A sort of, look, we all blend together kind of thing. And that was not her normal style to dress like that either. So it was very notable, very out of place, very jarring. As they're walking through the house, she doesn't seem to care about the case at all. They're trying to ask her pertinent questions. They're trying to stay on task. She's like asking questions about like, oh, did any of the furniture get damaged when you guys were moving things out to investigate? Oh, this pot that you have in here, my sister's been wanting it. Can I take it? Oh, I can't because it's evidence. Oh, okay. Are you sure none of my furniture got damaged or anything? Will I be able to get my furniture back? Like, she keeps interjecting with these questions throughout while they're trying to ask her very real and serious questions about very real and serious events that took place. But despite all this, like I said, they need Karla. They need her. Otherwise, the best that they can do is the charges for the Scarboro R-worder, and that is a significantly lower sentence. They want to make sure that Paul never gets freed, that he's never up for parole, that he never gets out. So they need that murder conviction. It is at this point that the most controversial plea deal in Canadian history is penned, also known as a deal with the devil. That's like literally what this plea deal is called, the deal with the devil. They tell her that if she pleads guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter for Leslie and Kristen, that she will be able to plead down and get 5 years for each count, plus an additional 2 years for Tammy's death. So it is a total of 10 years for the murders of the 2 girls in St. Catharines, and then just 2 years for her sister, Tammy. More than that, despite the fact that it's a 12-year sentence, she's eligible for parole after just 4 years, and she can apply for parole after only 2. So for the death of 3 people, whether or not she's the main perpetrator, she could get potentially just a 2-year sentence if she takes this plea deal. Obviously, she's going to take that deal. That is an incredibly good deal under the circumstances, but last minute, before the deal is signed, she negotiates a final clause, which is that when her plea deal is issued, when she goes to her hearing, there has to be a media blackout. So the only information that's released is that she has been charged on 2 counts of manslaughter, plus an additional 2-year sentence, but there is no explanation in the media as to why that is. The public is absolutely outraged. They have been deeply invested in this case. They've been involved. They've been asked to weigh in. They've been asked to help with search parties. They've been offered rewards. And now, when there's the first real legal development, they're kept in the dark. And people didn't like it. What is most frustrating about this is, had Paul's attorney, as he is legally required to, turned over those tapes, investigators would have had physical evidence. They would have never had to offer Karla this plea deal, and they wouldn't have wanted to, because those tapes revealed that Karla wasn't telling the truth about quite a few things. First of all, it is immediately apparent that Karla is an active participant in all of the torture, all of the assault, and the only thing that is not shown on the tapes are the murderers themselves. That is the only thing that isn't present. The kidnappings are shown, the torture is shown, anything sexual is shown. There are times wherein Karla is initiating things unprovoked on these tapes, where she is initiating assaults. And there is an argument that can be made that that could have been provoked by things that Paul has done off camera to scare her. And again, her sister's boyfriend did testify to the fact that he did see Paul slap Karla across the face, and her coworkers did say she was showing up injured to work. So at least some of this domestic violence does seem to be rooted in reality. However, please be patient and listen to everything that's on the tapes, because there are some things that simply cannot be explained away through that justification, and you'll see what I mean. The first thing that forensic psychologists noted when they viewed the tapes was that there was no sign of reluctancy from Karla whatsoever. She never hesitated at any point with any activity. It also shows Karla drugging the victims as well. Most notably, it shows Karla drugging Tammy in a way that is not at all like what she described to the police. She places the halothane in the rag, and rather than holding it a foot away as she went out of her way to tell police that she did, she places it and holds it directly on Tammy's mouth until she passes out. Something that Karla would have been very aware is potentially fatal. She would have been very aware of this. There are dogs that weighed the same amount as her little sister Tammy, who was just 15 at the time. More than that, she left out some very key details about the essay that her sister Tammy experienced. Not only was she giggling and laughing while Paul assaulted her sister, but then Paul instructs her as in Karla, to then go down on her then 15-year-old sister, who has been drugged by her, who has just been assaulted by her boyfriend, and she does. And you may say that that was done under duress, that she felt pressured. That's possible. But there is also a tape called, infamously, the fireside chat tape. Just 2 weeks after her sister Tammy had died, Karla is seen on camera wearing Tammy's clothes with her hair done in Tammy's signature French braid, imitating her voice, pretending to be her. She then, on camera, has sex with Paul, all the while pretending to be Tammy, and says disgusting things to the tune of, "You were wonderful. You took my virginity." This would have been 2 weeks after her sister died, after she went down on her own sister, after she served her sister as a weird, messed up Christmas present to Paul. I don't know about you, but that shows a severe lack of empathy to me. And I know, obviously, Tammy has been groomed by Paul. There's a lot of complex things psychologically going on. All I'm saying here is not that Tammy is not a victim of Paul as well. It's just that the things that Tammy has then done, I believe, are so unjustifiable that it cannot be overlooked that you can be a victim as well as a perpetrator at the same time. And so although there is a lot of things going on psychologically, in my opinion, and it's okay if you disagree, there are certain things that just, there's no excuse for. I don't know. And if you think that this would be the thing that would damage Karla's credibility most on these tapes, you would be wrong. Because the tapes reveal an entirely new victim that Karla never disclosed to police at any point in time, who we're going to be calling Jane Doe. The tapes reveal Karla taking her supposed friend, who was just 15 years old, to her house, inviting her over, having drinks, drugging her, all without Paul home, all without Paul even knowing about any of this, assaulting her. Paul comes home mid-tape. He's surprised, clearly, that he's like, "Oh, I didn't know that this was going to be here." She has very obviously, as evidenced by the tapes, taken initiative to do this on her own, and then she sort of offers her supposed friend, who has still been drugged, up to Paul to abuse as well. And the essay that Karla and Paul engage in against Jane Doe was actually so severe, without involving any sort of extra torture or anything, any other abuse outside of an essay. It was actually so severe that investigators were legitimately shocked that Jane Doe didn't die. And forensic psychologists who reviewed the tape, said that it demonstrated a clear lack of remorse. Her taking initiative is damning, and that this is obviously a very dangerous couple. This is a fatal couple. Unfortunately, that would not be the only time that Karla did that to Jane Doe. She then invited Jane Doe back again, who was completely unaware any of this had happened. Presumably, Karla told her some excuse for why she was so severely injured, and Jane Doe decided to give her a second chance, completely ignorant to the actual real cause, and all of this happened again. At which point, it was obvious to Jane Doe what had probably happened. In addition to that, it was very obvious that though Karla did tell the police the story about how she told Paul, Kristen's gotta be gone before my parents get here, it on the tapes was a lot more severe than that, and forensic psychologists did deem it to be sociopathic behavior. It was also made clear on the tapes that Karla had completely lied when she told investigators that she didn't want to be involved in any of these assaults, that she was super meek and scared, and she would be hiding in the corner, and then Paul would yell at her and make her do it and physically force her often to do it. That wasn't on the tapes at all. At all. The actual portrayal of Karla on the tapes was one that was very cavalier, very confident, very cold, very detached, and a lot of the things that occurred on those tapes were things that she seemed to have come up with in the moment. And so there were many instances wherein it seemed obvious that Karla had taken control. This would completely change everything if the investigators had had these tapes from the beginning point of discovery. What ended up happening, how the tapes actually were made known, was that Paul's attorney consulted his colleagues about the fact that he had these tapes that he had been sitting on for 18 months at that point in time without telling anyone, and they told him that he needed to step down from the case and relinquish those tapes because what he was doing was illegal, and that he was not, in fact, going to have his gotcha moment at all, but potentially get disbarred because he just concealed evidence for over a year and a half, and now was only coming to them about it mere weeks before trial. So the defense would get a massive pile of new evidence that completely changes the trajectory of their approach and just have a couple weeks to prepare. A new attorney took over the case for Paul and adopted a new approach. His plan was essentially to frame things as Paul had told him, allegedly, that Paul was really only an R-worder. That's all he was interested in doing, and have Paul admit openly that that is something that he does, that he is guilty of, that he is not likely to stop doing at any point in time, that he had done routinely and was planning on continuing to do for the rest of his life. But then Paul's attorney would point to the timeline of just R-wording versus the escalation to murder. And that timeline perfectly coincides with Karla, according to her account, and Paul knowing about Leslie. And so his idea was to highlight that fact and point out that it seems that Paul was somebody who was only interested in assault, and it wasn't until Karla became involved with these crimes that they actually escalated to murder. Paul would testify to the fact that he actually never planned on killing any of his victims, which is why he hadn't up until that point in time. That's why he always tried to make sure they didn't see him so that he could then let them go. Part of what he allegedly enjoyed was the fear factor that they're out there wondering if he's lurking around in a dark corner. But that Karla insisted that they couldn't be set free because they were a liability. On May 18th of 1995, the trial began. It was a literal massive media presence. Canadians compare it to a similar frenzy to what Americans experienced with the OJ case. I'm not sure if that's a perfect parallel just because OJ was already a mainstream celebrity, sort of the biggest A-lister of his time, but you get what I'm saying. There were actually tour buses that drove by the courthouse every day explaining the story of the case. Paul's charges that he faced go as follows: 2 first-degree murder counts, 2 counts of unlawful confinement, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated SA, 1 count of causing an indignity to a human body, which refers to Leslie's body being sawed. Something that Paul's defense had working for them that was heavily in their favor was the fact that though none of the deaths are shown on camera, the murder weapon and technique for one of them was. And the person who is wielding that technique and that weapon was Karla. And I'm referring to the halothane, which killed Tammy, thereby pretty effectively implicating Karla as at least one known murderer. Paul is up against an allegation for murder. Karla is shown, at the very least, leading up to killing not only someone, but her sister with the halothane. And she would have had lots of experience as a vet tech at that point and known just how not only dangerous that was, but the implications of how lethal it would be too, which is pretty hard to overlook. But again, Karla is actually not the one on trial. She is just a witness. So the jury may feel however they feel about that, but all Paul's attorney is really trying to do is just to argue against Paul's conviction as a potential murderer, not to literally actually indict Karla as the murderer. And so there is no way, at least in this trial, for her to be tried for murder. So it is just a matter, for him at the very least, of redirecting the heavier charges that Paul is potentially facing, and he has a pretty good person to point to. And the jury can see that as well. The other thing that played a major role with the way that this trial played out is the public wanted the tapes to be published for everyone to see. That sounds crazy, because it is. This is the first case that involved a camcorder in this way. This is the first case wherein somebody had documented their crimes on camera who didn't have some sort of background or greater access to cameras. This is the first time a civilian has used a camcorder in this way and gone to trial with that footage. So there's a great deal of implications about what should and shouldn't be allowed surrounding that. The public, again, it feels very personal for them. They've been involved in every single step of this entire case, so they want to be involved in seeing that footage as well. Family attorneys for Leslie and for Kristen immediately come together and they fight against this. They don't even want the tapes to be shown in court at all, because the public is allowed to sit in on court. And they feel strongly that that would just further re-victimize their daughters, which I personally, this is my personal opinion, happen to agree with that stance. And I think now that is a more normalized stance. So the agreement that the court came to was that the jury would be able to watch the tapes and the public would be able to hear them. So they rolled in a TV, had it pointed at just the jury box so that the back of it was facing the public, volumes loud enough for every single person to hear. And a lot of people actually, once they heard that audio, no one wanted to see the tapes once they heard that. And actually a lot of people regretted even hearing the tapes because their imaginations could so vividly fill in the gaps. Another thing that is really tragic about the tapes being shown and the public being able to hear them is that Leslie's mother insisted on staying in the courtroom. A lot of people tried to convince her that that was a bad idea, that she shouldn't do that, that she should try and remember her final moments with Leslie as happier memories and not bear witness to her suffering. I think from her perspective, she probably felt like she probably felt a great deal of guilt. She probably felt like she had abandoned Leslie by locking that door. And so if I had to guess, it was probably a situation of a mother not wanting to abandon her daughter again, wanting to be there for her through this, even if it's just retroactively, feeling like she doesn't have the right to turn away. I really wish, as noble as that sentiment is, that she hadn't listened to those tapes though, because the absolute overwhelming trauma that she must have experienced from hearing those things, compounded with the trauma she was already dealing with from this entire ordeal, she didn't make it through the whole thing. She ended up literally collapsing and shaking and convulsing, just went into absolute shock. It sounds like, at least from my experience as someone who suffers with PTSD and has PTSD episodes, it sounded pretty much exactly like what most of my PTSD episodes are like. And her friends had to carry her out of the courthouse. Additionally, a lot of journalists, a lot of crime journalists couldn't sit through the whole tapes and had to go outside. People threw up. People had to go outside and lie down. A lot of journalists in Canada who covered crime literally quit after hearing those tapes. A lot of people who were involved in the legal system, who were involved in this case, literally quit after seeing or hearing those tapes. One of the jurors was so heavily affected by those tapes that she couldn't let anyone touch her for 6 months. Like, even in a casual way, a casual touch. I don't mean like deeply intimately. Her husband, 6 months later, asked if he could give her a hug. And that was the first time she let anyone touch her. A lot of people, both on the investigation side, jury side, all of it, a lot of people ended up getting divorced. Almost all of them ended up experiencing severe PTSD. Several attempted to commit suicide because they couldn't escape the flashbacks from what they had seen or what they had heard, and are in heavy counseling to this day as a result. And that the mental repercussions of that is also why so many people ended up getting divorced, because they were just in such a dark state for so many years that their marriages became completely unsalvageable. So the tapes really were very extreme. Very extreme. I can't emphasize that enough. Basically, the defense argued that Paul, he wasn't like the mastermind behind the actual murders, because the murders were very well done, if you can even say that. There was essentially no evidence left behind. The only area in which they weren't well done was in terms of the disposal of the bodies, which was apparently, according to the defense, left up to Paul, which does align with the narrative that they are crafting. It then came time for people to come up to give their testimony, and Karla's mother, Dorothy, was called to the stand. A lot of people had been speculating leading up to this moment. They knew she was going to witness, and people weren't sure what she would say, because though obviously Tammy had immensely suffered at the hands of Karla and Paul and died, and it was a horrible situation, you would be surprised how many instances there are wherein somebody murders a family member, a close family member, and the parents still end up visiting that person, still try and cultivate a positive relationship, forgive them. Some of that is born out of, if that's the only child they have left, they don't want to lose both. But you would just be surprised how often that happens. So when Karla's mother got on the stand and she went against Karla, there was a little bit of a sigh of relief from investigators. Dorothy testified claiming that Karla was completely lying about the domestic violence. She said she did not believe that she was abused. She didn't witness any evidence of abuse. She didn't see any injuries. That Karla seemed to glow around Paul, and really nothing about the relationship signaled to her that it was an abusive relationship. Brief little aside here, that can happen when it is actually an abusive relationship, where people can successfully hide the abuse, whether it's victims covering up for their abuser, whether it's the abuser covering up the abuse that they're committing, whether it's both. That is something that can happen. So I don't want anyone who has been abused and no one around them knew or realized because they seemed so happy to feel invalidated by Dorothy's statement. There's also, some inherent biases here since Tammy is dead and Karla and Paul are the reason. So there is that. But Dorothy, bottom line, says that she doesn't believe Karla is being honest. She believes she's completely making this up to essentially try and get away with this. The other thing that she said that does actually call into question at least Paul's controlling nature is that Karla often went on girls' trips completely unsupervised, which she said didn't really align with the controlling narrative of him calling and not letting her drive. Additionally, some psychologists, some experts took the stand who specialized in battered women syndrome, and they said that when a battered woman commits acts of violence, it's almost always towards the perpetrator and it's almost never towards an innocent third party. And that when there is somebody who may also be experiencing DV who is then abusing an innocent third party, that is not somebody who is suffering from battered woman syndrome, and that is not a result of battered woman syndrome, which again, battered woman syndrome is one of the symptoms of that is that you can then become complicit in things you otherwise wouldn't out of fear. This was pretty significant because a lot of DV victims who were diagnosed with battered woman syndrome, when finding out that that was sort of the explanation that Karla and her defense were publicly giving, they felt really invalidated. They were offended. They felt like it painted what they've gone through and what they deal with on a daily basis as a result completely inaccurately, and they really resented it. Another significant moment is that when Paul takes the stand, as I said, he says that Karla is the only one who's interested in killing the girls, that he had them blindfolded, he fully intended to let them go. And more than that, he actually said that Karla specifically killed Kristen alone, that he left the house and when he returned, Kristen was dead, that Karla had told him that she attempted to escape, and when trying to reel her back, she ended up strangling herself with the electrical wire in the process, and that she then took a mallet and bashed her skull in to subdue her, and that this was the explanation that Paul was given by Karla upon his return. It's then time for Karla to take the stand. Psychologically, there's some interesting things just off the bat with Karla taking the stand. Similarly to the moment where she dresses as a schoolgirl, people really read into her outfit that she wore when she took the stand. She chose to wear an outfit that was all the same color as the stands themselves, a beige color. She almost blended in. It was almost like a camouflage, and a lot of people felt that she was trying to make herself look meek, like small, like she was barely there, and that she was trying to play up the battered woman narrative, and that was a part of that. People who knew her also said that the way that she dressed was very uncharacteristic even for a formal, serious event like this. But I do think that is kind of hard to say just because there is advice from your attorneys about what you should wear in court. And there is also just the element of like, yeah, maybe you've seen someone in business casual, but it's a bit of a different environment, especially with heavy media coverage. So I'm not sure how significant that was. It might have been incredibly significant. It might be real insight into her psychological state, or it may be less significant than it seems. The cross-examination was pretty direct. They started by showing a picture of her sister Tammy when she was alive, and they were like, "Who is this?" She seemed very surprised by that. She identified her sister Tammy. Then they showed her in her casket. They asked, "Who is this?" She identified her sister Tammy. And they did the same thing with each and every one of the victims. It seemed that Karla started to get less rattled as this went on, and more so shifted into a state of agitation. And she started to sort of fight back on the stand, which actually worked against her favor, because when she looked rattled and she looked surprised, that sort of played into the image that she had been presenting. up until this point in court. But then as she got more frustrated and she started to fight back, it actually made her come across as pretty domineering, and it really worked against, and this is not necessarily fair, but this is just the public perception, it really worked against this idea that she isn't somebody who would stand up for herself. She doesn't know how to defend herself. She's just been wired through grooming and all these traumatic events to be somebody who just sort of rolls over. That really misaligned with her behavior on the stand, and it left a very bad taste in the jury's mouth as well as just the general public. Really, just not to mince words, the jury absolutely hated her, especially after having seen the tapes. The jury then contemplated overnight, so it took them 2 days, and they eventually decided to find Paul guilty on all counts, including murder. He was also deemed a dangerous offender, which means he is very unlikely, almost impossible for him to be released from prison at any point in time, given his counts and given the fact that he has dangerous offender status. At this point, Karla is still able to apply for parole after just 2 years. So very, very different outcomes for those two. But then we also have to factor in the Jane Doe footage, because pre-trial, the public wasn't aware that there was an additional victim. So once people were exposed to that footage, that audio, it brought the plea deal into even more question, because this is 2 separate accounts of Karla with the same victim doing something seemingly of her own accord, unprovoked, that is just as violent, save for the murder aspect, as much of what Paul had done and been convicted of. And people felt so passionately about the fact that this needed to be re-examined, that Karla needed to be re-examined and tried, that they actually generated over 300,000 signatures in favor of this. And again, Jane Doe was also 15 years old. She was also a minor. These are vulgar acts captured on footage. This is a case of CP as well. A few weeks later, after this public outcry, after all of these signatures, the justice decided to review Jane Doe's case and see if this plea deal needed to be overturned as a result. 3 years after the plea deal had been issued in May of 1999, the justice returned to inform the public that they would not be overturning the plea deal. Their justification for this was that they felt that it was in the public's best interest not to do so, because they would lose credibility with potential witnesses in similar cases in the future if they thought that their plea deal could essentially just be thrown out at any given time. This justice also importantly claimed that Jane Doe, when reached out to, was indifferent to the idea of a trial against Karla for her crimes against Jane Doe. And it wasn't until May of 2005 that it came out, literally 12 years later, that Jane Doe not only was in favor of a trial against Karla, but that Jane Doe was actually never even consulted by the justice or anybody in the legal department on whether or not she wanted there to be a trial against Karla. And she actually went on to say that she found it disgusting, and I quote, disgusting, that Karla was able to, through the prison system, achieve a psych degree while incarcerated, and Jane Doe actually doesn't have a college degree at all. So because of the tax dollars that Jane Doe had paid, Karla was able to achieve a higher level of education than she ever had. Then on July 4th of 2005, Karla was freed from prison. She is the only convicted serial killer in Canadian history to not only serve such a short sentence of just 12 years, but to be freed at all. On top of that, since she was never charged for any of the SA, she was not on any sort of registry, and she couldn't be registered on one unless she was. Then jumping forward to 2016, Karla ends up moving to Quebec. She picks an area that is away from the main city. It's primarily French Canadian. Almost everybody just speaks French there, and so she's less known. She actually ended up marrying the brother of her defense attorney, which I find to be just especially disturbing, because her defense attorney had to watch all of those tapes multiple times He had to review them multiple times for the sake of their case, and he also had to bear witness to them in court. And his brother chose to marry this person. And he very well may have been against his brother doing that. I just find that so disturbing, especially because the audio was available to the public. They then had 3 kids together, and Karla changed her name. And you'll never guess what she changed her name to. Like, you'll actually never guess. She changed her name to Leanne Fordley. Leanne, just like the girl that she worked with, that her and Paul were seemingly actively grooming, who was in the exact same demographic, who looked exactly like phenotypically all of the other victims from this case, who they were having come over to their house every weekend trying to get her to drink with them, who Paul took a special interest in and would constantly ask about her love life. She changed her name to that girl's name. To me, and this is just speculation, it really does feel like she picked that name because that girl is like the one that got away or something. And I find that really deeply disturbing because, I don't know, maybe Leanne's a more common name in Canada, but I don't know any Leannes. That's all I'm saying. And I'm from Texas, and that's like a very southern name. Even more disturbingly than all of that, she actually, because of her name change and because of the fact that she specifically moved to somewhere that is French Canadian, people mainly speak French there, she was able to get involved with her children's school without any of the other parents or students realizing who she actually was. And she was very involved. She joined the PTA. She, on multiple occasions, was left in charge of the children unsupervised, both in a school setting and privately. And the parents and the school and the other students didn't find out who she actually was until one day reporters followed her, they found her, and they followed her all the way to the children's school when she was dropping them off in the morning and just swarmed her when she was getting out of her car, walking them in. And at that point it was such a spectacle, and everyone could hear what the media people were yelling out at her, yelling out her actual name, that they all very suddenly realized who she was, especially because now she looked different. She was back to her brown hair. She had a completely different aesthetic. Her face is the same, but her hair was like, when it was blonde, it was like a very distinct 80s style. It's just like the 1980s Barbie with like the feathered poof right there and stuff. And so she did look very different with brown hair and a slick back bun and glasses on and stuff. And so everyone, upon finding out this information, was deeply disturbed, most notably the parents who had their children left with her unsupervised. And the last thing that I'm going to say, the last detail of this case, was after fighting for 20 plus years, Leslie and Christine's family finally got the legal system to agree to allow them to destroy the tapes as well as any copies. They were fighting that we don't want our daughters to be re-victimized or this footage to leak fight for over 20 years. And they finally won. Let me know what you guys think about this case. I mean, this is a long video. I know. I hope that you watch all the way through, because then you'll see what I mean about, like, you have to watch the whole thing, because, like, things are not as they seem. But there's just so many layers to this. There's so many things to unpack. There's so many levels of different types of grooming and groomers getting groomed by groomers. And there's just so much violence, so much degradation, so many sad moms. Honestly, there's just so many sad moms. Really, just everything about this is just so vile and putrid and terrible. And there's a reason that it's like the most infamous case in Canada. People literally in Canada to this day describe it as the case that caused Canada to lose its innocence. Which, if you know anything about Canada's participation in World War I and their war crimes, that's saying a lot. But yeah, I just, honestly, I've been researching this for like a couple weeks. I finished my research starting last night from 9 p.m. going all the way till 4:30, just compiling stuff. And then I filmed from 4:30 to right now, and it is 10 a.m. So I've I can only debrief so much because I've been up so late and it's just such overwhelming information, but just let me know what you guys think about this. There's so many like details of this to examine, like the clothing choices and like the choice for Karla to get a psych degree and like the ambiguity around like Paul's family history. Like there's just so many random little details like that just like really dig into you, where you're like, what is that? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Anyway, so I'm back on my normal upload schedule. I have I have an editor for the first time. Thank you, Derek. Shout out to Derek. I'm going to be uploading super regularly now, every single Saturday. I'm going to upload 2 history videos every month, a mukbang, and 2 react videos. So, you know, there will be some lighter stuff mixed in, and the podcast is coming back as well. So there should be like a literal ton of content on my channel every single month now, and it'll be super regular because Derek's gonna keep me on track. Alright, if you watched this video all the way through and you liked it, consider literally liking it because it helps me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I hit 11,000 subscribers, which I'm really proud of, and thank you guys so much for subscribing to me. Alright, I'm gonna go to sleep. Thank you. Bye!